Well, you know what? Let's let's go ahead and get started. So we can just get into it, and if people come in a little late, I think it's going to be no problem. So yeah, my name's Nate Solon. I'm a FIDE master, chess coach, and author. This is my first time doing US Chess School, so thank you for having me. Definitely an honor to be here. Thank you also to chess.com, who sponsors this. So the topic today and next week, actually, I'm subbing in for Johan next week as well, is going to be changing the nature of the position versus maintaining the status quo. So I found this is a really popular, or a really common rather, type of dilemma you face in a game. You have one option, keep the tension or change the position, exactly. You have an option to change the position, like make a capture, an exchange, a sacrifice, a pawn break, some way of a one-way door, a way where you change the position, it's not going back. Or you can just play an improving move that maintains the nature of the position and improves your position a little bit, right? So sometimes this is an easy choice, like it's just the way you can transform the position in a way that's incredibly good for you, and you just do it. Or your position's so desperate that any way to change the position is worth a shot. But other times can be quite a tricky decision. For example, you have an advantage, you're applying pressure, but you have an opportunity to sacrifice material for a dangerous attack. But you can't calculate exactly that it's winning in every line. So that's tough because your chances are good in a long game applying pressure. Maybe you sacrifice and you win quickly, but maybe that opens the door for you to lose the game too. Or you're under pressure, you have a bad position, and you have a way to change the position, maybe solve some of your long-term problems, but it gives your opponent some risky possibilities. And again, you can't calculate everything for sure to know what's going to happen. So those are tough decisions. Like anything in chess, it's always going to come down to the specifics of that position. But the one thing I want you to keep in mind is it's always a comparison, right? You have to work with the options you actually have in the position and compare them. And the reason I say this is when I do coaching and I give a position, let's say there are options A and B, very often what the player will say is, I would do A for reasons X, Y, Z. And I'll say, okay, what you're saying makes sense. What about B? And then very often they go, oh, I didn't think about that, right? So it's always a comparison. The evaluation of each option is only meaningful compared to the other. So try to be really clear and explicit in what your options are and how you're comparing them. But I think this is all going to be a lot more clear once we get into specifics, some concrete positions to work with. So let's jump into this. Any questions before we start analyzing some positions? Okay, so we've got a position on the board, and it is white to move. I think someone said, I can't believe your opponent played a Peerts. This actually started out as a London, believe it or not. My opponent played an early d6, and I played knight c3 and e4. But that's not too important for the moment. Sometimes in the, if your opponent plays like d6, you can sort of Joe Bava style knight c3 and threaten e4 and do it if they don't respond, which is what happened. But the position on the board, I just played h3, attacking black's bishop, of course. And rather than retreat it, which is what I kind of expected, my opponent played e5 and counterattacked my bishop, right? So obviously I've got some choices here. I could go ahead and take the bishop on g4. I could move my bishop to several squares. I could take black's pawn. So have a think about this. Let me just got to remind myself of how to, there's a way on this Chessable classroom platform to give this as a quiz. Let me just figure out how to do this. Quiz, excellent. And maybe we'll do like 2 minutes. So hopefully you should be seeing on your screen the quiz and the option to play a move for white. So have a think about this one. And when you're ready, play the move you would play on the board. Okay, got some answers coming in. Feel free to take your time. You do have a minute or two to think about this. Okay, excellent. So we have a mix of answers. A lot of people saying H takes G4, a lot of people saying D takes E5. Several people suggesting the tricky move Bishop D2. That's an interesting one. And one person saying Bishop E3, which is actually what I played in the game. So I played Bishop E3. I went for the option of maintaining the status quo, just kind of keeping a normal position. And after Bishop E3, white is doing fine, but my opponent just played Bishop H5, and we had kind of a normal position where white's probably a little better, but it's not that simple. Let's look at, let's see, what do I want to do first? Okay, quite some people said D takes E5. Now, one thing you should be aware of in this structure is, in general, D takes E5 in this sort of Peartz type structure, or Philidor structure, whatever you want to call it, is not something you want to do because, not arrow, what the, okay. How do I make like a red? I don't know. Okay, my point is this bishop's locked in, right? The bishop has a hard time getting active, but if you play D takes E5, D takes E5, this guy is gonna have much better prospects. So usually you only do this if there's a tactical justification. So does anyone want to say, what was your plan to follow up after, let's say, D takes E5? Not sure how, if Johan's style is to call on people, or if, does anyone want to suggest a move for black here? Okay, I can call on people. Okay, let's say, okay, I'll just pick the first one, Chess Crusher 88. Give me a follow-up here. Okay, well, anyway, I see some people suggesting Bishop D2. So I think you can do this, but okay, yeah, typing in chat is absolutely fine. Oh, I can click on their name, thank you. Okay, well, let's look at Bishop D2 for now. I think after something like takes, and maybe just something like Knight D7, it doesn't look too bad for me. Like, I know you can do a discovery. I don't see a dangerous discovery at the moment, but okay, white's got the bishop pair. but it looks like black's going to be able to develop the rest of their pieces. So, if you want to say white's better here, yeah, I can definitely believe that, but I don't know if it's such a big advantage. Black could also maybe try to hold on to that light square bishop, but they have to watch out for some discoveries. And then some people also suggested bishop d2, which is quite an interesting move. Moving the bishop and setting up a discovered attack. I am wondering if can black try to get really greedy here and just take all of this stuff? Okay, so knight d5 suggested here. But I think queen d8, right? And takes. So I guess you're going to want to damage black's pawn structure. And yeah, those pawns are pretty ugly, but also black's up a pawn. So I don't know how great I would feel about this. But okay, let's look at h takes g4, which, by the way, I think if you're considering this position in the game, h takes g4 is the first move I would consider. Generally, when you're calculating, when you're considering options, you want to start with the most forcing and the most promising, right? And h takes g4, I mean, if it works, it might really work because it lets us change the position quite a lot. So h takes g4, e takes f4. What do we think about this? It's an unusual position. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen this trade before, like a bishop trade, h takes g4, e takes f4. It's not something that usually happens. But how do we evaluate this? Okay, I think I can click on someone. So I'm getting a lot of like between +0 and +1. Crying face has an extremely specific evaluation, +0.53555. Yeah, so as far as how the position changed, well, I should try to, call, okay, I love Panda. I love Panda. Are you there? Would you like to make the case for your evaluation if you're there? Maybe not. Okay, I see people are typing in the chat. Oh, you can't speak to me, people. Yeah, Greg, I did click on the mic. Let me just. Oh, user has no microphone connected. Okay. Maybe we'll try. Who else voted for h takes g4? Tory Chess. It's saying user has no microphone connected. Okay, well, nobody's microphone is connected, huh? All right, let's plow forward. Feel free to type in the chat. Okay, so well, here's what I'm thinking. E takes f4 relieves a lot of the pressure from white center. Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, so this I'll let someone control the board for like more of a move-oriented puzzle. This one is more of like evaluation, sort of conceptual. So e takes f4 relieves the pressure from white center because that pawn on e5, it was sort of a foothold for black in the center, and it was also pressuring d4. After e takes f4, white now has this classical pawn center with e4 and d4 that is unopposed. It's difficult for black to challenge. So that's a big upside, I think. Also, this pawn on f4 could be weak. And finally, h takes g4 also opens the H file for our rook, right? So there are a lot of big pluses to this transaction for white, but something you might be concerned about, something I was a little bit concerned about during the game, is it looks like 2 pawns are attacked here, right? Obviously this is pinned, so e4 is not currently defended, and g4 is also attacked. So let's do this as a another quiz. How would you deal with this with white? Because 2 of your pawns are attacked, so you got to figure something out to do. Okay, I think most people have answered. All right, so many people saying queen d2, and this is indeed a very good move. So this answers the threat by breaking the pin. So knight takes e4 obviously is not possible, and you're counterattacking f4. And if takes, material still equal, but white stands much better because white has total control of the center, better development. Black's king is going to have a hard time getting out of the center. f7 is a problem. So a move like castles, bishop c4, e5 is coming. White has a huge positional advantage. So queen d2, very good option. I guess black could try to play g5. Yes, I'm not Greg. I guess maybe we look kind of similar. I don't know. But this is just like way too risky for black. Like you can give up this g pawn. You could castle. You can play e5 at some point. You know, this is not something we should be scared about. Black is going to probably get run over very quickly if they try to do this. So queen d2 is quite a good option. Actually, a few people suggested there's multiple good solutions in this position. Actually, so queen d2 is sort of the simplest, but g5 is a good dynamic solution as well. And let's see. So okay, let's try to. I'll let someone who selected. So Racer Bill. Can you now make a move on the board to show us your intention of how you're going to meet knight e4? Okay, let me try kind King Sam. Okay, so I'm clicking. I don't know if this is working. Okay, no worries. Let's continue. So this is actually a really good move for white as well. Okay, Racer is typing in the chat, queen e2, excellent. And let's just continue the line. So the knight is attacked. It looks like d5 is forced. And let's just continue this line for one more move. Okay, yep, Racer Bill, I see that you typed it. Several people suggesting knight d2 or castle queenside. I like castle queenside better because it's another developing move and gets our king out of the center and gets out of this pin. And black doesn't have a good response to knight takes e4, queen takes e4. I think when I checked this game with the engine, the computer wanted to play king d8. So that says a lot about the quality of black's position here, because obviously we'll take our pawn back and white is massively, massively, massively ahead. Black's king in the center and no development. So I think it's a matter of taste. Queen d2 or g5, both very, very good for white. But maybe the more important thing to understand is that h takes g4 is actually massively good for white. Okay, so your drag have a good flight. And a lot of you found that, some of you did not. I did not in my game. I played bishop e3, which was a much worse move. So something you always want to consider when you're reviewing your games, and a mistake is not just what the correct move would have been, but what went wrong in your thought process, right? That's what you really have to address. So for me, I think my strategy when I play chess, particularly when I'm the higher rated player, which I was by a good margin this game, is I try to, keep it pretty safe, keep it in the middle of the road. Don't let anything crazy happen. And eventually your opponent makes a mistake and you win. And that works a lot of the time. But you don't want to take that too far to the point of not taking advantage of a really good opportunity, which in this case, h takes g4 is. And I think for me, it was because it was so unfamiliar. It's like a very weird exchange, like this pattern that I don't know if I've ever seen before. But if you think through it logically, based on white's center is not challenged, white has the open h file, black has the weak f4 pawn. There are a lot of upsides to this for white. And then you just have the concrete problem to solve of how to deal with the attack to these pawns. But as we saw, there's multiple good solutions to that you can figure out if you think through it a bit. So, okay, let's move on to the next example. I think, should I have... Still figuring out, okay, I'll just reload this PGN. Okay, this is black to play. We will do another quiz. And let me set that up. Okay. So I included a few more moves in this one. By the way, I got this position from Dr. Jean Adabai, who's got some courses. He's got some really good training material. So shout out to Dr. Jean. I thought this was a great training position. Okay, so far, 6 different moves suggested. Lots of different ideas in this position. Okay, I think most people have answered. Not sure if there's a way for me to see when everyone has answered. Definitely most people have answered at this point. Okay, go ahead and let's start analyzing. So yeah, lots of different moves suggested. I guess I'll just let the quiz finish so I don't mess anything up. But we have a lot of people saying knight d7, a lot of people saying rook takes c2, several queen c7s, knight a4. What does knight a4 do? Oh, that's an interesting move. Okay, so well, let's start with rook takes c2. This was played in the game. And the idea, of course, is you are going to come in with queen takes f4, and you're threatening queen g4 mate, and maybe queen takes h4. But white has a lot of different defensive tries here. They can defend the mate with rook d3. Rook g1, I guess, gets refuted pretty easily. But after a move like queen d3, is there a checkmate here? So we can go queen h4. And you can take this. Not sure where the king is going to run to. Maybe h1, maybe h2. Maybe f2, I don't know. And okay, you've got two knights versus two rooks. You've got a bunch of pawns. White's king is exposed. But I don't see a forced checkmate, and a lot of things could happen here. You could win, you could draw, you could certainly lose from here, even if you don't take a perpetual. So it's not terrible, but it's not looking that simple either. And by the way, queen d3 was not the only move for white to prevent checkmate. You have to figure it, rook d3, rook g1, king g2, queen c3. A lot of these moves are flawed, I get it, but if you're going to give up a rook, you have to check all those moves. And if one of them turns out to work for white, you might lose the game. So from a practical perspective, that's a bit of an issue. And the big point I want to make here is, if you're thinking about like a very committal move, like a rook sacrifice, you should remember the theme is comparison, right? It's not just how promising is the rook sacrifice, it's also how good is your position if you don't sacrifice the rook. Because that you want to go for the option that you have that is the best, that gives you the best chance of winning, or at least drawing. So how would you evaluate the starting position just as it stands? Yeah, black is better. So we've got two knights against a rook and pawn, which, according to this sort of beginner point value thing, are both 6 points, but I'm sure you all know usually the minor pieces are often better actually than the rook and the pawn. And especially in this position, because the position's relatively closed, our pawns are solid. The only open file white has access to is the e file, but our e6 pawn is very well defended. So white's rooks are struggling to find anything to do. Whereas our knight on f5 is obviously beautifully placed on an outpost, looking at these two pawns. Our knight on b6, not so good, getting dominated by a pawn on b3, which is not what we want. But of course, we could think about rerouting that knight. So the key point here is, if you're thinking about, if you're in a position that's very winning in the status quo, and you're thinking about sacrificing a whole rook, you should be really sure it's winning to go for it, or it's probably going to decrease your chances of winning the game overall. And this is, by the way, this is something that can happen, I think, if you do a lot of puzzles. Like in Puzzle Rush, if you have a position like this, like you kind of know that whatever the most forcing aggressive move is the first move. So like it would be rook takes c2. But in a real game, you're not like forcing moves don't always win. Sometimes they lose. Sometimes they lead to unclear positions. Like you're not guaranteed that the forcing line works. Okay, so what do we do with this knight? Several people suggested the move knight a4, which is super creative. I hadn't thought about this move. So I guess the point is you want to play queen a3 check, and then if queen d3, rook c3. So okay, that's interesting. And then what if white goes back? Knight h4. Okay, yeah, I mean, this is quite interesting because white doesn't want to walk into like king g1, knight f3 is a fork. Maybe white has some way to dance the king that saves them. I'm not sure. I mean, it looks incredibly dangerous. But also notice there's like a lot of moves for white, and it's getting a little bit confusing. Some people were also suggesting c4, which is an interesting reply. I don't know if this helps, though, because there's still queen a3 check. I guess our rook can't come in now. I don't know. Maybe this is good, too. But I think it's pretty confusing. White has a lot of options. And again, if you mess up calculating one of those options, maybe you lose the game. So from a practical perspective, I think the best course of action, black, is knight d7. The moves a lot of people said. And the idea here is the knight is going to g6. And when it lands there, white's position is going to collapse. And there's not a ton white can do about this. They have no pawn breaks for the moment. c4 we would just capture. No real targets to attack. I guess they could play queen e2, queen h5, but opening the h file is only going to help us. We'll just put our rook over there and crush them even more quickly. So basically, we just move our knight to g6, and we're going to win either h4 or f4, and just crush from there. So I think, yeah, this is clear. Someone says, what about c4 after knight d7? Yeah, this is a great suggestion, and it demonstrates the same type of thinking from the other side. When you are way ahead, you don't want to take any unnecessary risks. When you're way behind, you should take any risk you can find that gives you a chance. So I think c4 is a good practical move, because at least this forces black to calculate. Whereas if you play, if you just wait, this is very easy for black. We don't even have to calculate. So I think this is a very smart move. And for black, how should we react to it? Maybe we can do it as another quiz. This isn't part of my analysis, but it's an interesting question. I'll put a move to. I have to enter a move to give the quiz. I don't actually know what the best move for black is. But we can analyze this. Okay, so it looks like more people saying d takes c4, but also quite a lot of people saying knight f8. So definitely we should analyze d takes c4, and I assume white's intention here is probably to play d5 and try to open those files for the major pieces. And then, yeah, we have the Razor Bill, Crying Face, Rohan pointing out c3 intermediate move advancing the pawn, which does look like a powerful move. So I think, maybe like queen f2. I think white has to keep f4 defended. Al19 saying you suggested it first. Okay, awesome. Sorry, I missed you. Queen c2. I was thinking maybe white has to keep f4 defended, because if you play queen c2, queen f4, well, now black is getting the attack that we were even contemplating sacrificing a rook for, but actually we didn't sacrifice anything and we got a pawn, so that seems pretty good. So maybe queen f2, but then, well, c2 looks pretty interesting, for one, and then our rook maybe can come in, or we could just take on d5. Maybe this is, actually queen takes d5 looks pretty nice, because we're ready to meet rook takes c2 with queen d3 check, as Tory Chess and others are pointing out, indeed. So I think black gets to have our cake and eat it too in this variation. We're getting the material and the attack. So I think if great suggestion, c4. This is a great example of this kind of risk reward comparison thinking I'm talking about. Not a bad try for white to confuse the issue, because if white doesn't do this, they're just going to get rolled over without a fight. But I think if black buckles down and calculates it, it looks like this doesn't work. And it's also a good example of back to black's thinking. Previously, we played knight. We didn't want to take the risk of sacrificing our rook, but we can take the risk of allowing this d5 pawn advance if we calculate precisely and we make sure it works in our favor. Now, several people suggested knight f8, which is, this is also reasonable to try to win without really calculating. And probably still good for black. I mean, maybe c5 and like this version is not as good for black because it's more difficult to use our rook along the c file. But we still have the idea of knight g6, and I would imagine black is still much better. So this is an example of like a closer decision where we stand better, we can take a little risk, but maybe calculate it precisely enough to determine that we should go for it. Or we can maybe just play it super, super safe and still have a very good chance of winning the game. Okay, let's move on to the next position. Okay, and we'll do another quiz. This one is black to move. Okay, lots of different answers for this one. Okay, a few more seconds. Okay, so quite a lot of different moves. It looks like by far the most common suggestion was knight c6. This is definitely a natural move. It's developing our last minor piece, challenging the knight on d4. And if white takes this, I think we would definitely be pretty happy. Probably bishop takes. I mean, even pawn takes we can consider, but bishop takes looks quite decent. We have less space in the position. So a trade is not unwelcome. But the issue with this move, and by the way, this is a more positional one. If you look at the engine, like a lot of options are pretty close here, but we're kind of working on thinking through these positions logically. So after knight b3, I think that the tricky part here is what's your next move as black? Okay, someone says confused about an answer. Well, okay, we're gonna work through it right now. I'll tell you why I like the line that I gave as the answer, but you know, it's not like a tactic where there's one clear win and everything else is much worse. It's a complex position. Yeah, I think it's tough to find a move for black here, right? I mean, maybe we can go rook e8, bishop f8. That looks like kind of a typical maneuver in the position. But you know, white can defend e4 if necessary. With like bishop f3, seems tough to find an active plan for black in the position. a5 also suggested. Thinking about a4, good idea. I guess white would probably just block that. Maybe we could go knight b4, but I think from a practical perspective, a position like this is really tough for black because white has more space, white has more easy improving moves, and if you don't find a plan here, you can lose very easily. You really want to avoid positions where you're lacking activity or counterplay or an active plan. So that's why I prefer the move c5. And of course, this move does come with a downside of we are weakening d5, the square becomes a hole, and we are weakening d6 backward pawn. So yeah, Lou Coco pointing out d6 is weak, and that's absolutely true, but it's a trade-off. We should think about what we are getting in return. And so after knight b3, again, knight c6 also reasonable, but the line I gave, bishop c6, bishop f3, rook e8. So in contrast to the position after knight c6 on move 1, black has a bit more, black carved out a bit more space with c5. Black has an active plan of pressuring e4. Maybe bishop f8 next. And Awesome Sarthik says, what about b5? Yeah, indeed, b5, b4, expanding on the queen side is another active idea. So we took on some weaknesses, we took on some risk, but if you have a choice between a position where you're getting suffocated and you can't do anything versus a position where you've got some weaknesses, but it's double edge and you have active play, your chances are much better in the double edge position. So that's why I like this as a practical choice. Some other questions about some other options. Let's see, d5. A few people, Lou Coco suggesting d5. d5 on which move? Were you on move 1? Let's see. Yeah, I think several, or maybe Not sure. Third move. So c5, knight b3, bishop c6, bishop f3. Oh, d5 here. Okay. Yeah, this also makes a lot of sense. If e takes d5, if the center opens, black's probably doing really well, because then white's f4 advance opening the king is just going to be a liability. But probably, I guess, white would play e5. And I guess we'll go knight e4. So maybe white can take and do something like this and go after the e4 pawn. Oh, so several people are saying e takes d5 wins. Okay. E takes, knight takes. Ooh, okay, tactics time. Yep, I missed it. But some people saw it. Bishop a5. Nice. Okay, yeah. It always comes. Okay, so bishop f3 is the only chance. And then how does this play out? Probably queen takes. I think queen takes or bishop takes also looks good. But queen takes. This one I don't know about. I was thinking bishop takes. I think this one wins for white because rook e8 takes and it's mate at the end. So white remains a pawn up unless I miss something else. But I don't think so. I think this is actually the end. Okay. So good question, d5. Positionally, absolutely breaking in the center is something we're in the market for. But yes, it turns out to have a tactical flaw. Bishop a5, sneaky move, easy to miss. And by the way, I think there is also b6 doesn't help because we're going to come in and hit this rook. So bishop a5, very nice move. Okay, let's do one more position. Okay. So this one is white to move. Okay, yeah, a lot of different suggestions here. Most common suggestion was f4. This was played in the game. This is not a pawn break that helps us though, because after all these exchanges, we've weakened the e5 square, so black can play queen e7 and follow up with knight f6, queen e5 potentially. And this has really improved black's prospects. Someone, Lou Coco saying, I think there's f5 first. In which position do you mean? But okay, this e5 square that black can utilize is a big deal. What else do we have suggested? B takes c5. We could do. You do have to consider d takes, and maybe black's knight gets access to that knight's blockading square. Let's see, what else was suggested? G3, fighting against knight f4. Reasonable. G4 I'm not a fan of because that really weakens these dark squares. Likewise, several suggestions for b5. To me, this move looks a little odd because the queen side is the side of the board we want to be playing on as white. That's where we've got more space. So typically you don't want to close the side of the board where you've got more space and where you want to play actively. Now, in the long run, you can maybe play a4, a5 and transfer the battle to the b6 pawn, which could work, but it does take some time to set that up. Something you might consider as well is, what is black's idea in the position? And black's typical pawn break in this type of King's Indian structure is, of course, going to be f5. So after b5, b5, f5, black might be getting a little something going in this position. If you just kind of wait, maybe they can play f4, knight h4. If you give black enough time over there, they're going to draw up some sort of kingside attack with that pawn chain. So that's why my favorite move in the position is actually bishop d3. Just prophylactic thinking, stopping f5, black's main idea in the position. And then if it doesn't do anything, we can play bishop e3, maybe at some moment take rook b1, right? We're trying to build up our play on the queen side in the long run. And there is something, we should also consider knight f4 for black. But in this case, taking works out better for white. I think e5 immediately might also work. Baruch fe1, we've got this coming and e5 coming as well. And compared to the other position where we played f4, it's harder for black to utilize the e5 square. If f6, I think we can probably go for e5 anyway. This admittedly isn't that simple, but black's king is extremely drafty over there. But the point of this example in the sort of larger context of what we looked at here is the previous position where it was black to move, that was a position where the status quo was against black. If you don't do anything, you have less space, you're getting squeezed. There's a very high risk that you lose the game in the long run. This is the opposite. With white, we've got more space in a closed position. So the status quo favors us. A long game is in our favor. So we don't want to change the game with a move like f4 unless we can determine that it's clearly good. In this case, it actually kind of backfires because we do give black that e5 square. So when the status quo favors you, you don't actually need to do a whole lot. As long as you can stop your opponent from doing anything, like you can just chill, you're good. So we just play bishop d3 to stop black's main idea of f5. Okay, I think I think we've got time for one more example. Let's try to squeeze one more in. So the chat is getting restless. Let's let's hold out for one more. We can do it. Okay. Black to play. Okay, most people went for the exchange sack, rook takes e5. Well, I don't know about most people. A lot of people went for rook takes e5, which is a good decision. We are under a lot of pressure, especially on the f7 square. So we can give up this rook for a knight and a pawn. This basically really consolidates our position, and white is no longer attacking us. We are down material, but not that much. Knight and pawn versus rook, not that big of a material disadvantage. Our rook can come over here. White's got some weak pawns. This knight on d6 is an excellent piece. This is acceptable compensation for an exchange. Not necessarily going to be easy to win this game, but our position is pretty tenable, and we can think about, popping this knight out somewhere more active, like, I don't know, we can maneuver that knight. So this is a pretty acceptable position for black. But again, the theme of comparison, what makes the exchange sack so good, relatively speaking, is all of our other options are not so good. So knight f5 suggested, but this move is, this attacked. This is a problem. So white actually has several good moves, but I see Lou Coco suggesting knight takes f7, which is indeed a good move for white. King takes, and then what is the follow-up here? Exactly, rook takes f5, and white is going to be coming out ahead. I guess technically you've got two rooks for the queen, but white has a bunch of pawns, and with this exposed king fighting against a queen, I don't think you're going to survive that one. So that's the issue with knight f5. I don't think knight takes f7 is not white's only good move either. Even white going for the exchange sack with rook takes f5 looks incredibly dangerous as well.